Breaking update: France's government is on the verge of collapse and the crisis is shaking Europe to its core. The country is drowning in debt, with a staggering €3.34 trillion deficit that grows by nearly €5,000 every single second. And it's not just France, the United Kingdom is also staring down the same path. Here's the part most people don't know. For decades, 14 African nations were forced into an arrangement that sent up to 80% of their yearly revenues straight to France. That deal kept France afloat for over 50 years. But times have changed. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Senegal have expelled France, cutting off Paris from the very resources that kept its economy stable. Now, the fallout is massive. Companies are leaving France, unemployment is rising, and the state can't keep up with the weight of its own debt. The lifeline from Africa is gone, and with it, France's economic safety net. Meanwhile, the UK still leans heavily on Nigeria, but analysts warn that if Nigeria follows the same path and pushes back, Britain could face a collapse similar to France. What we're seeing right now is Europe paying the price for decades of dependency on Africa. The old system is crumbling, and the cracks are finally out in the open. So here's the big question: is this the beginning of Europe's economic downfall, or can these nations survive without Africa's resources?
The news broke like a thunderclap and the world stopped to listen. Paris woke up to chaos. Markets trembled. Boardrooms erupted in emergency meetings. France's top economists sat in shock, staring at red numbers flashing across their screens. And what happened next? Pure panic. Phones rang non-stop inside the palace. The French president called an urgent midnight cabinet meeting. Trade ministers demanded answers. CEOs of major French corporations lined up outside government offices, some almost shouting because their entire futures were now at risk. For years, French companies had relied on African markets, African mines, African labor, and African money to stay afloat, and overnight that door was slammed shut. Let's not sugarcoat this. This is not just an economic dispute. This is a rebellion. This is the moment Africa looked Paris straight in the eye and said, enough. Enough of one-sided deals. Enough of being treated like a supplier of cheap raw materials. Enough of watching European cities prosper while African towns remain in poverty. And this time, Africa didn't just talk, it acted. Picture this: €3.5 trillion in investments frozen, projects halted mid-construction, contracts cancelled, capital redirected into new African sovereign wealth funds. For the first time, Africa is saying, we will build our own roads, our own factories, our own future with our own money. France is terrified because it knows the truth. Africa is its economic heartbeat. Without Africa's resources, its cheap labor, its energy supply, France would not be the France we know today. The lights in Paris are powered by uranium from Niger. French supermarkets are stocked with cocoa from Ghana, fruits from Côte d'Ivoire, and cotton from Burkina Faso. French companies have built their empires on African soil, and Africa has finally decided to evict the landlord. The shockwaves didn't just hit Paris, they tore through Brussels, Washington, and London. Global investors panicked, currencies fluctuated. Analysts began warning that Europe could face its worst economic crisis in decades if Africa maintains its stand. And here's the kicker: Africa isn't backing down. From Dakar to Nairobi, African leaders are speaking with one voice. They're saying, we are not your colony. We are your equal. If you want to do business with Africa, you will do it on Africa's terms. This is history being written in real time. But France doesn't know how to handle it. The French media is calling this a disaster. Economists are calling it an earthquake. Politicians are calling it economic warfare. But Africans are calling it something else: freedom. For too long, Africa's wealth flowed one way. Out. Now, that wealth will circulate within Africa, funding its own growth. Imagine €3.5 trillion being reinvested into African infrastructure, African education, African technology, African manufacturing. Imagine millions of jobs created, new cities rising, new industries booming. This is not the collapse of Africa, this is the rise of Africa. And here's the part that terrifies Paris the most: this is just the beginning. If Africa can halt €3.5 trillion worth of investments overnight, what's next? What happens when Africa creates its own currency? What happens when African nations start processing their own oil, refining their own gold, producing their own steel, and no longer shipping raw materials abroad? The answer is simple: the balance of power shifts permanently. This is why France is panicking. This is why European leaders are meeting behind closed doors. This is why the US is suddenly calling African presidents, offering new deals, new promises, new aid packages. Because the world is realizing that Africa is no longer the silent partner in the global economy. Africa is now the driver, and the world has no choice but to follow. So, buckle up. What we are witnessing is not a temporary tantrum. It's a continental reset. It's the dawn of African economic independence. And when the dust settles, Paris will have learned a painful truth: Africa is done playing by their rules. This is more than a headline. This is the start of a revolution. France is in shock. Its political elites sit in closed-door emergency meetings in Paris, their faces pale as they stare at graphs that only go one direction down. Its bankers, who for decades fed off the wealth of African nations, suddenly feel the ground shifting under their feet. The French stock market trembles, the CFA franc system is under threat, and the media is desperately spinning stories to calm the public. But the truth is too big to hide. Africa has spoken, and its decision has sent a thunderclap across Europe. It started as a whisper quiet discussions between finance ministers in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, Accra, and Abidjan. They met behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of Western advisors, away from the interference of old colonial masters, and away from the consultants who for decades dictated what African budgets should look like. And then, with one voice, they said enough. Enough of the exploitative contracts that drained African wealth into foreign banks. Enough of the neo-colonial policies that forced Africa to remain a raw material supplier. Enough of the arrogance that treated African nations as children in need of supervision. And then came the announcement that sent Paris into chaos. African nations would halt 3.5 trillion worth of investments tied to France. No more infrastructure projects awarded automatically to French companies. No more resource concessions with unfair profit sharing. No more secret agreements that gave French corporations tax-free access to Africa's riches. Overnight, the financial pipeline that connected African capitals to Paris was cut off, and France felt the shockwave instantly. Imagine the scene in the palace as the president of France was briefed on the decision. His advisors warned him that French companies were about to lose contracts worth trillions. Construction giants like Vinci and Bouygues, oil majors like TotalEnergies, banking powerhouses like Gungan, all were suddenly staring at a black hole where guaranteed profits used to be. The French president demanded answers. How did this happen? Who allowed Africa to move without warning? But Africa was not waiting for permission. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim took to the podium with his trademark calm and firm tone. He looked into the cameras and said that Burkina Faso would no longer sign deals that made its people beggars in their own land. The era of French dominance, he declared, was over. His words were echoed by the leaders of Mali and Niger, who reminded the world that Africa is not a charity case but a land of wealthful and that has given too much for too little in return. And it wasn't just the Sahel. Senegal, tired of decades of French fishing fleets emptying its waters, announced that it would review every maritime license. CTE d'Ivoire said it would renegotiate its cocoa deals to ensure that Ivorian farmers, not European corporations, set the price. Ghana joined the chorus, stating that its gold exports would now be refined locally before being sold abroad. This was a tidal wave of economic sovereignty, and it was unstoppable. Paris panicked. Calls were made to Brussels. The European Union tried to step in, promising dialogue and cooperation, but Africa stood firm. For the first time in modern history, African nations were not asking for aid, they were demanding respect. The streets of African cities erupted in celebration. Crowds gathered in Bamako waving flags and chanting slogans of freedom. In Ouagadougou, young people danced in the streets, proud that their leaders were no longer kneeling before foreign powers. This was not just a financial decision, it was psychological liberation, and the effects rippled far beyond France. American investors grew nervous, realizing that if Africa could cut Paris out of the equation, Washington could be next. The IMF and World Bank called emergency meetings, worried that Africa's boldness could inspire other regions to do the same. China, on the other hand, applauded the move, quietly sending delegations to sign new, fairer deals with African nations. But for France, this was nothing short of an existential crisis. The French treasury, long dependent on African reserves and raw materials, faced a gaping hole. The CFA franc system, which kept African economies tied to the euro, began to unravel as nation after nation hinted at creating its own currency. Without Africa's capital, France's influence in global forums weakened. Its ability to project power in West Africa crumbled. This was the nightmare scenario France's former presidents had warned about for years. But now there was no going back. The African decision was not made in anger, it was made in confidence. For decades, France had treated African nations as an extension of its own economy. French politicians openly called Africa France's backyard. French troops were stationed across the Sahel, not to defend African sovereignty, but to defend French access to uranium, oil, and gold. But the new generation of African leaders no longer feared cutting the cord. They had new partners, new allies, and most importantly, the support of their people. The 3.5 trillion investment halt was not a threat, it was a statement of independence. Africa was declaring, to the world that it would no longer subsidize foreign powers at its own expense. It was declaring that the wealth of Africa would stay in Africa, and that any partner who wanted to do business would have to come with respect, not arrogance. France tried to save face. French media outlets ran editorials calling the decision short-sighted, warning of economic collapse in Africa. But the fear-mongering did not work. African economists went on television and calmly explained that Africa had survived colonization, it had survived structural adjustment programs, and it would survive this. In fact, they argued Africa would thrive because this time the wealth would finally be invested where it belonged. In Africa's industries, Africa's infrastructure, Africa's people. This was a turning point not just for Africa, but for the entire global South. Leaders in Asia and Latin America watched closely, realizing that Africa had opened a door they too could walk through. No longer would former colonial powers dictate the terms of trade. No longer would natural resources be siphoned off for the benefit of foreign capitals, and the message to France was crystal clear. Africa is not your colony. Not anymore. France was still reeling from the announcement when the second wave of African actions hit. This time, it wasn't just about halting investments, it was about rewriting the rules of engagement. African nations announced the creation of a new Continental Investment Authority, a body that would vet all foreign contracts to ensure that no deal undermined Africa's sovereignty. The message was simple. If you want access to Africa's markets, its resources, or its talent, you must respect Africa's terms. In Paris, the panic became desperation. French media channels aired hour-long debates where analysts shouted over each other, accusing the government of losing control. Business leaders warned that French GDP would contract sharply without Africa's participation. One French minister admitted on live television that the entire French energy sector relied on African uranium, particularly from Niger, and that without it, French nuclear power plants would face shortages. The French president called an emergency summit, inviting European allies and American representatives to discuss the crisis. The mood in the room was tense. The Americans offered intelligence support to try to understand who was behind Africa's sudden economic rebellion. Some European leaders suggested sanctions, but others warned that this would only push Africa closer to China and Russia. Meanwhile, in Africa, something extraordinary was happening. Nations that had once been rivals were now working together with unprecedented unity. Mali and Cote d'Ivoire, often divided politically, jointly announced a plan to build their own processing plants for cocoa and cotton. Ghana and Nigeria agreed to co-finance a massive oil refinery that would serve the entire West African region, reducing dependence on foreign fuel imports. The African Union convened an emergency session, where leaders unanimously voted to accelerate the African Continental Free Trade Area (AfCFTA) implementation, turning it from an idea into a reality overnight. The streets of African cities buzzed with excitement. Young people held up placards reading "Africa First" and "Our Wealth, Our Future." In universities, students debated the economics of sovereignty, excited about the opportunities that lay ahead. For the first time in decades, Africa's youth felt like their leaders were fighting for their future, not selling it away for aid packages and empty promises. France, on the other hand, scrambled to offer concessions. French diplomats were dispatched across Africa, promising debt relief, new trade terms, and even cultural exchanges. But it was too late. Decades of exploitation could not be washed away with last-minute gifts. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim gave another speech that made headlines around the world. He reminded France that Burkina Faso was no longer under its control, and that every nation had the right to choose its partners freely. "We are not anti-France," he said. "We are pro-Africa. And being pro-Africa means we will no longer allow anyone, not France, not the United States, not anyone to dictate the terms of our future." His words resonated across the continent. African leaders began speaking with a new confidence, one that reflected their people's will. They were no longer afraid of economic retaliation because they had discovered that Africa's combined strength was its greatest shield. Together, they represented over 1 billion people, vast mineral reserves, fertile agricultural lands, and some of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Together, they were unstoppable. The economic impact on France deepened. French conglomerates began laying off workers as African contracts dried up. The French media tried to paint Africa as ungrateful, but this only fueled anger on the continent. Africans were tired of being portrayed as passive recipients of French benevolence. They reminded the world that for decades, Africa's resources had built European wealth and that the time had come to build Africa's wealth instead. China and Russia, sensing opportunity, moved quickly. Beijing offered financing for massive infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative, but this time with more favorable repayment terms. Moscow offered military partnerships and technology transfers, promising to train African engineers and scientists. India, Turkey, and even Brazil sent delegations to sign new agreements, proving that Africa had plenty of options outside the West. France's worst fear was coming true. Africa was no longer a captive market. The climax came when African finance ministers announced that they would collectively create an African sovereign wealth fund, seeded with the money that was previously earmarked for French projects. This fund would be used to build African-owned factories, tech hubs, railways, and power plants. For the first time, Africa's money would stay in Africa and grow Africa. Paris was now officially in crisis mode. The French parliament held emergency debates, with opposition leaders accusing the government of losing Africa forever. Some called for military intervention to protect French interests, but this idea was quickly shot down as politically impossible. France no longer had the support of African governments for its military bases, and any intervention would risk open conflict, something France could not afford. At the same time, African leaders doubled down. They signed mutual defense agreements to protect their sovereignty from external interference. For the first time, there was talk of a pan-African security force, one that could defend the continent's economic and political independence. In the markets, the CFA franc began to lose value. As African nations announced plans to transition to a single continental currency, French banks panicked, fearing a mass withdrawal of African reserves. This was more than an economic challenge, it was the collapse of a system that had propped up French power for decades. The French president went on television and appealed directly to African leaders, saying that France was ready for a new partnership based on respect. But his words sounded hollow. Africans had heard this before. What they wanted was action, not speeches. And so, the 3.5 trillion investment halt remained in place. In the months that followed, Africa began to transform. New African-owned companies emerged to take on projects that once automatically went to French firms. Local entrepreneurs, engineers, and workers now had a chance to build the roads, airports, and power plants that their nations needed. This was the birth of a new African industrial revolution, one that was owned and controlled by Africans themselves. The world watched in awe as Africa's economies, instead of collapsing as many Western analysts predicted, began to grow even faster. By investing in themselves, African nations unlocked a new era of innovation and self-reliance. For the first time in centuries, Africa was not just the supplier of raw materials, it was becoming a global player in manufacturing, technology, and finance, and France. Its influence continued to shrink. The days of dictating African policy were over. The conclusion of this seismic shift is simple yet profound. Africa has discovered its power, and it will never go back. The 3.5 trillion investment halt was not just an economic move, it was a declaration of freedom. It was Africa telling the world that it will chart its own course, write its own destiny, and claim its rightful place on the global stage. France may have panicked, Europe may have worried, the US may have watched with fear. But for Africa, this was the dawn of a new day. A day where the wealth of the continent would no longer be shipped overseas but would nourish the very people who have guarded it for generations. This is not just history in the making. This is Africa's future, bold, unstoppable, and finally free.